Hey y'all. So the Calling Singapore was this past weekend, and I decided to take Iyslander to it and managed to take her to a top 8 finish. So here's the deck tech for it. Before we get into it, I'd like to preface this discussion with a couple of things. Firstly, a lot of what you're going to see here were meta calls, and I'll speak more specifically about them when I get into the specific cards. But basically, I just want to make it clear that a decent number of the cards in Iyslander do feel fairly fluid, and so they can and they should be swapped with other cards based on the meta that you are expecting. And when I say meta, I mean both the heroes that you expect to see and also how those heroes are going to play into you. So, for example, Guardians, like I expect Guardians to aggro me down. At least in the current meta, I expect them to be very aggressive into me and not give me space. And so for that reason, I cut the energy potions from my list. I'm down to one energy potion uh, because energy potions into an aggressive guardian can be a huge liability, and you also don't need it if the guardian's being very aggressive. But whereas if you start seeing Oldhims that run Heart of Ice, Oasis Respites, and maybe even their own energy potions, where their plan is to survive your combo, then maybe you're going to need to maybe you're going to need to bring in all the other energy potions. So that's what I mean by a lot of the cards in here were meta calls. Well, the cards and the exclusions as well. Secondly, I want to talk about like my philosophy around playing Iyslander into aggressive decks, and the distinction between what I like to call reactive disruption and proactive disruption. So, Sigil of Permafrost, for example, is a card which I would say is a reactive disruption play, in the sense that it is, it's something you do on your opponent's turn, and also the disruption it provides is somewhat dependent on what your opponent does. Whereas cards like Command and Conquer and Aether Icevein are what I call proactive disruption, where you are forcing your opponent to interact with you on your turn. Like they can't just take damage and not suffer some sort of consequence for it. So I personally much prefer the proactive disruption gameplay. And just to expand on this a little, like I know a lot of people when they saw my list, they immediately categorized like CNC and Erase Face as sideboard tech for Illusionist. And then they looked at the other reds in my list and wondered how I was ever dealing enough damage into aggro decks. Well, the thing is, I actually bring CNC Erase Face into every matchup where I'm not doing the Frost Hex combo, which is basically every aggro matchup. So actually over the weekend, the only game where I didn't have CNC and Erase Face in the 60 that I presented was in game one of the CC rounds when I was facing Dorinthea. There's a lot to talk about regarding the distinction between proactive and reactive disruption, but the reason why I prefer the proactive plan is because it is a lot less reliant on what my opponent decides to do. For example, I've noticed that a lot of aggro players are starting to realize that they have a much better time into Iyslander if they go tall instead of go wide. So, for example, Briars are looking to set up plays like Bramble Spark into Erase Face, which is a 3-card hand that also has an extra resource to pay, like for a Frostbite in response to a Bramble Spark, for example. And it doesn't give the Iyslander any value from the fuse effect of the Sigil of Permafrost, because it's just one big attack and with nothing coming after it. So any of the frostbites you give them just don't do anything. Or even something like just a runic reclamation from Viserai. It's just one tall attack that ignores any reactive disruption plays. Like even any frostbite that they give you, doesn't matter. You've already played your attack, or any fuse sigil permafrost. Same thing there. So the reactive disruption cards to me started to feel a little weak because I noticed a lot of my opponents were switching to the going tall game plan. And so I switched to the playstyle where it's you have to interact with me right now on my turn. And that is the playstyle that I came to and came to prefer when it comes to Iyslander. So onto the list. The way I have it set up here is that if there's a card that ever comes out, like even if it only comes out for one matchup, then it's not in the core, it's in the sideboard. The cards on the left over here and the cards on the right are in the sideboard, which kind of means that the sideboard is like kind of big, ends up being pretty big. But that's just the way I like to think about things. So as I go through the sideboard plans here, I will be talking about which cards come in for the different matchups. But in the end, the Excel sheet that I'll link in the description will just tell you which cards to take out to present your 60. Like, there's a total of 73 non-equipment cards here, and the Excel sheet will just tell you which 13 to take out based on the matchup. So that'll be hopefully easier to understand. All right, so let's start with the equipment. So the weapon is always Waning Moon. This card is just, it's really good. The headpiece is always Coronet Peak. Just another absolutely solid card that fits into Iyslander's game plan very well. The way I think about this card is this. If you consider that taking away the 4th or 5th card from an aggro deck as reducing the damage output by around 4, then you've just turned the blue you pitched into a block 4, which is simply just great value. One other thing about this headpiece, though, is that if we start to see more Iyslanders, then there's a very real argument to find space for Null Rune Hood, because you never want to activate this into Iyslander. Right? The boots are always Stormstriders, because, I mean, duh, you're a wizard. It's like the best boots you have. And then the chest pieces, they're in the sideboard. So most of the time, you are just running Tunic. As Iyslander, your games tend to go very long, so you can definitely get a lot of value out of your Tunic. In exactly 3 matchups, you get to run the new Wizard chest. And in those matchups, this card is just amazing. You get so much value out of this card. And the way I read this card is basically the first point of Arcane you block each turn is free. Because when you pay 1 to block 1 Arcane, you get half a Waning Moon activation on this chess piece. And since Waning Moon costs 2, that basically equivalents to 1 resource. So you basically just got the resource back. So first Arcane each turn is free. That's why I look at the chest. And for the arms, most of the time you're running Ironhide Gauntlet. And this card just naturally synergizes very well with our playstyle of using resources on the opponent's turn. For a small number of matchups, we bring in Metacarpus, either for the extra 1 AB or for some extra reach. So before going into the non-equipment cards, I want to start with the fundamentals of my list. So first, when I say fundamentals, the first thing is how many blues do I ever want to present? In any 60 that I show my opponent, how many blues are in that deck? And my answer to that is 40. It's quite obvious that, if you draw a 4 red hand as Iyslander, it's really bad. And has a real chance of just losing you the game on the spot. But 3 red hands are also incredibly bad. Because depending on what you have in your arsenal, the 3 red hands could really just cripple you because of how limiting they are. For example, you can't pitch for your arsenal card, like if you had a Channel Lake Frigid in there, you can't pitch for it. You definitely can't activate Waning Moon. But say your arsenal costs 0, well, you can't play it and also peek on your turn, because then if you do that, then you can't arsenal a blue, and that just feels bad. So in many ways, the 3 red hands are also just terrible, and so we do want to try and limit the number of times that happens. However, we also do want to strike a balance of having enough reds, because obviously they're the power cards. And so for me, the balance I liked most was 40 blues. Because there were times where, you've worked so hard to gain tempo, and then tempo is on your side, and then you draw a hand of 4 blues, and you're like, I've just lost all the tempo I've gained because I can't do anything relevant on my turn. So you also do need a healthy amount of the, power cards. So that's the first fundamental of my list, 40 blues in every matchup. There is one matchup where I go 39, but yeah, around 40 is where I want to be. The other fundamental is the number of ice cards I want to have, and I like having it at around 30. Sometimes in some matchups it goes up a little bit more, because you need these to fuse, and you also need these to keep Channel Lake Frigid around. And you never want either of these things to be awkward, so around 30-ish ice cards is where I found that I never have a problem trying to fuse anything. So that's the second fundamental, around 30 ice cards in every matchup. Alright, so moving on to the core of the list, there's 40 cards total, and I'll start with the blues. Alright, so basically all the blue ice cards that block for 3 and can be played from Arsenal are in the list, just simply because of how versatile they are. Like, they fuse, they pitch, they block, and they can be played from Arsenal. So they're just amazing. I really like them. Of course, there are more things to say about each of them than just, the versatility. Yeah, so Frosthex, really key into Guardian and also Dory. Against aggro, though, I would recommend never playing this card. It's almost always better just to block or Coronet Peak with it. It's so tempo negative to get this out, and you already have another tempo negative play you want to do in Siddish Chill, and you really can't afford to do too many of those. So I've never found Frosthex to give me enough value in aggro matchups, so definitely do not recommend ever playing them there. On the flip side, Channel Lake Frigid, Superman to Guardians, but absolutely probably your best card into aggro, because it basically single-handedly gives you the window to pivot if you're behind. And if you're not behind, it's just single-handedly just like sort of straight, just like puts you so far ahead. These 3 damaging spells here are very interesting. The first 3/4 of the game, I don't like arsenaling these at all. And so they're basically just blue ice block 3s. But once you get your opponent to about 10 life or lower, you're really going to want to arsenal these over most other things. So, in the first half of the game, I'm kind of like, the first 3/4 of the game, I want to arsenal stuff like the Incarcerations or Winter's Bites that, tax my opponent too. But later on, my opponent's at like sub 10 life, I really want to arsenal like the Aether Hail and threaten like 5 damage on their turn. Then there's this pile of cards here that I call the I disrupt my opponent 2 resources gang. These can really surprise your opponent, because usually most people are playing around 1 Frostbite. And so suddenly being taxed 2 can just kind of make their hand crumble sometimes. And special mention to Cold Snap, because this card is just, it's so good. It instantly replaces the card that you pitched. So you're back to 4 cards, but you still have 2 floating, and you've taxed your opponent 1, maybe 2 if they had an arsenal. So you use your 2 floating to Waning Moon for 3 resources, and you have your 4-card hand again, which basically means this card reads from arsenal 0 cost, tax your opponent 1 to 2 resources, and deal them 3 arcane, which is basically 4 to 5 points of value on a single card, and that's just solid. As you can't ask for more than that. Also special mention to Arctic Incarceration. If you're on the Frostex game plan, so against a Guardian or against Dory, definitely value pitching these for second cycle. Because once you have 3 Frostexes on your opponent, this card basically just reads 0 cost, deal 6, which is obviously incredible. And Winter's Bite, just another tax your opponent 2 resources. The nice thing about Winter's Bite is that it has Go Again, so sometimes if you find yourself having too many cards on your turn, you can actually abuse this Go Again. Well, not abuse, but do some interesting things with it, where if you Winter's Bite and you still have other cards in hand, your opponent has to pitch a red. Has to pitch a blue, because if they pitch a red, you can just Coronet Peek them and just get another card out of them. So if they know what they're doing, they kind of have to pitch a blue if you do this. And then you follow this up with like some other disruptive red play, and that feels really good. Alright, then we have Insidious Chill. This card just straight up enables the hero. In both strategies, the Tempo strategy or the OTK Frostech strategy, you need this card to function, though to differing extents. In the Frostech strategy, depending on how slow your opponent is, you might need to set up 2 of these. But if they're being aggressive, then just 1 is fine. In the Tempo strategy, as long as you manage to get 1 out without taking too much damage for it, then you're cruising. And this just enables you to overcome the life lead, because typically you're a little behind, at least for the first half of the game. Lets you overcome the life lead and just take the game away. 3 Ice Eternals. The card is essential for the Frostex combo. Against aggro, I'm almost always just using it to block or to pitch. But there are rare cases, and we play Iyslander, you know what I'm talking about, where you kind of have, sometimes you just have, all the tempo. Your opponent didn't manage to do much on your turn, and then it comes back to you, and you have, 5 cards, and you're like, these are all blue, I can't do anything with them. But then Ice Eternal, bails you out of that. It's an X spell, so you pitch as much as you want into it. And so it lets you use your whole hand. Maybe it's not the most efficient, but at least it lets you do something pretty good with your 4-card hands, which I find Iyslander has very mediocre 4-card hands usually. And also more importantly, because it's an X spell, it kind of can help you keep channel around for that second or third turn, which can, along with the Frostbites this already gives them, can really just destroy their turn. And those things against aggro are definitely rare. So I mean, most of the time it's a blue block 3, which is a great floor. Then there's this one Hypothermia. At least in the current meta, I find myself bringing all 3 into most matchups. But in the matchups that I didn't want this in, I realized I was only coming up to 59 and just needed 1 more blue, and so I decided one of these Hypothermias is just in the main board. Though usually you're against a matchup that you want this in anyway, so yeah. And then finally, 2 blue Ice Veins. This is a meta call because most aggro players that I was testing against were only bringing AB2. And into any opponent that has less than 3 AB, this card is just another one of those tax your opponent 2 resources on their turn, but also has the upside of triggering Insidious Chill sometimes. And so often that combination of just Insidious Chill plus this on hit just ends the opponent's turn. So yeah, one of the meta calls here as well. And so this is on my watch list, so to speak, where if aggro players start bringing AB3, then I'm probably gonna look to, cut these. Onto the core reds of the list. 3 red Ice Veins, I mean, the card is just nuts, especially when you have Insidious Chill. Similar to blue Ice Vein, if the opponent can't block this completely, which they often can, then the combination with Insidious Chill just, swings the tempo, like, to your side. 2 red Aether Hails with the 3rd in the sideboard. This is just the most efficient of the vanilla red damaging spells. Because, you pitch a blue to this, and then you have 2 floating to Waning Moon for a total of 6. And both the strategies, the Tempo and the Frost Tech strategy, do need some amount of just, like, tall arcane spells. Just to whittle the opponent down, or even sometimes just as a Strider's target to close out the game. Like, only having red Ice Veins as your Strider's target can mean that you may never get a good opportunity to, like, Strider something out. And that's obviously pretty bad. So, yeah. That's why the 2 red Aether Hills. And it's a similar thing for the 2 red Freezing Points. Just tall arcane that either whittles them down or finishes them. Of course, in the Frost Text game plan, I'm actively looking to get at least one of these in my pitch deck. Because once there's 3 Frost Texts, this thing comes in for 8 arcane. And if you manage to combo this with the Sigil of Permafrost, where that 8 arcane is also threatening that many Frostbites, depending on how much damage it deals, then that's basically an OTK. Yeah, and against aggro, this has the upside of triggering Insidious Chill. So, like, I've definitely had games where I just fuse this on my turn against aggro, and it's like, I didn't get any extra damage out of it, but it triggered my Insidious Chill, and so it was like a DIY red Aether Ice Vein. And then there's also the tiny percentage of games where you Striders this on your opponent's turn after you've already given them a Frostbite or 2 from your arsenal. And then this thing is coming for 6 to 7 on your opponent's turn, plus a Waning Moon on top of that, and then that can be a little more than what your opponent's expecting and could catch them off guard. Right, so onto the sideboard plans and discussions, and I guess this is where the main meat of the discussion is. And for the purpose of this video, I'm only going to discuss decks that I found are fairly prevalent in this meta, but the Excel sheet that I'll link in the description does have the details for most of the other heroes. Okay, so let's start with the aggro decks, as the sideboard plan for them are quite similar, at least like half of it's pretty similar. And for the aggro decks I'm talking about are 5, Viserai, and Briar. And I know now Dash has come up as well, but that's a separate discussion. I'll get to that later. For now I'm talking about 5, Viserai, and Briar. So the first thing is that the 3 CNCs come in. This goes back to what I said earlier about proactive disruption. CNC is just the pinnacle of that concept. And remember that your opponent doesn't have armor into you. The 2 Rune Blades will be on AB 2 to 3, and 5 doesn't have non-blade break armor anyway, so it doesn't matter. And all 3 of them should be on Tunic. So if they are blocking this, they are blocking entirely from hand. Like, there's no, give you 1 card and a bunch of armor. And so given that, as long as they have an arsenal, no matter how they block this, I'm happy. If they just take 6 and lose their arsenal, that's really good. If they block out 1 card, take 3, lose their arsenal, that's also really good. And even if they block 2 to save the arsenal, I'm still very happy. Because, as we said earlier, when the aggro opponent goes from a 5-card hand to a 3-card hand, you've actually gotten much more value than 6 points of life. You've probably gotten around 8 to 9 points of life just from reducing from 5 cards to 3 cards. And other than that, when they block with 2 cards, it may feel bad that, you didn't leak damage on your turn. But then it goes to their turn, and then they only have 2 cards to pitch with, which means that they either can't pay through your attacks if you frostbite them, or they can't pay for your Waning Moon. So you may not leak damage on the CNC turn, but you will still leak damage from your Waning Moon on their turn. So either way, you do end up just leaking damage. It's just on their turn instead. The other thing is that all 3 of these aggro decks have a ton of 2 blocks. Basically everything in 5 blocks 2. And most of the attacks in Briar block 2, like the Snatches, the Rabbles, Lightning Surges, and most of Viserai's non-attacks block 2, like the Morven Skies, the Read the Runes, Incantations. So without their armor, it is actually very non-trivial for these aggro decks to block CNC with just 2 cards, while still having a turn. So what I found usually happens is that they actually just take the 6 and lose their arsenal, which is just, it's amazing. It's amazing value. Next, all 3 Erase Face also come in. Everything that was said earlier about being able to block CNC also applies here. And into Viserai in particular, this just shuts off so many things. And personally, I was finding Viserai to be the hardest of the aggro decks going in, which is why I did devote a lot of practice into it. And yeah, so into Viserai, this turns off Morven Skies, which is their bread and butter. It turns off the hero ability, which by extension means it turns off Moderate Tide, Gloomveil, and Shrill of Skullform as well. So, like, the number of times I saw Viserai block my Erase Face with a Moderate Tide was just amazing, and I was very happy to see that. Into Fire, it turns off Phoenix Flames, like, at the minimum, but it also turns off stuff like Spreading Flames or any of the other cards they have that care about, like, multiple Draconic Chainlinks. Briar is the most sus, like, this card's, like, the most sus into Briar, because if they have their CMH or their Bramble Spark, then this hurts, but otherwise it may not do much. So, against Briar, I wouldn't recommend taking damage to send this at them, but in the end, you know, if this was taking the spot of, like, just a red Ice Bolt in my list, I'm still happier that this is there instead of the red Ice Bolt. Because if they don't want to interact with me and they just don't care about the damage, well, then the Erase Face comes in for 6, whereas the Ice Bolt comes in for 5. There was a consideration for 3 yellow Ice Veins instead of, like, these CNCs or instead of Erase Face, but to me that felt like it was going a little too deep. And was not providing as much value as the physical attacks. Again, it just comes back to my opponent not having armor. Also, as the meta progresses, and if people start respecting Iyslander a little more, then I expect to see more Oasis Respites, in which case the yellow Ice Vein stock goes down even further, because, you know, that's an exact 4 Oasis Respite prevents the 4. So, like, just a play of, like, Tunic into Respite the yellow Ice Vein is just, you know, I don't want to... I just don't want to play into that. Next, we add in 2 Channeled Bleak Expanse. Again, this was a meta call. At first, I had 3 of these because every Briar, Viserai, and Fi I knew were on the Belittle plan. And it's just miserable playing against Belittle as Iyslander, because you're like, I'm going to tax you 2, and they're like, I don't care about it, I just gain 2 for free from Belittle. But now that it seems that most of the Briars and Viserais have moved off of Belittle, I have cut these down to 2. And I didn't cut it completely because it still hits a very good number of things. Like, okay, if you're against Fives are still running Belittle. So it hits that. It also hits the Art of War, and Flamecall Awakenings are, like, the big ones. Worst case, turns up their mask, although to be honest, they're unlikely to have a threat on a mask trigger anyway, because you usually cut them off. For Briar, even if this just stops a Snatch on hit, I'm pretty happy about the value I got out of it, because that means I didn't need to care about trying to figure out how I'm blocking the Snatch breakpoint. I can just put a 3 block in front of the Snatch, play this, and they don't get to draw the card. Of course, it also hits other things. It stops Gorganian Tome, it stops Sonata, and, you know, maybe once in your life, Briar plays a Tome of Harvest into you and you have this in Arsenal, and it stops that. But I don't think Briar should be trying to resolve Tome of Harvest into you anyway, so that's unlikely to happen. Against Viserai, again, there's Sonata and Become the Arknight. Though I would caution you about putting this in Arsenal against a Viserai whose deck you don't know, because a number of them are starting to cut Sonata, so, you know, that can be a bit of a toss-up, whether, you know, they're actually playing the card. So this isn't as much of a high-priority target, high-priority Arsenal target into Viserai. Of course, do be mindful of the hand that you have, like what you're going to do on your turn before you play this. If you're trying to do, like, a fused Aether Ice Vein, then, you know, obviously, like, don't play this. But again, this comes back to, I feel a lot of the disruptive attacks I'm doing are CNCs and Erase Face, so I don't actually need the fuse effect on my turn a lot of the times, and so I'm totally okay having the Channel Bleak Expanse. So all of these decks go wide, so we add in a 2nd and 3rd copy of Hypothermia, and also our 2 copies of Blizzard over here. Hypothermia is not the best against Fi, to be honest, so I'd recommend using it mostly as a pitch card in a matchup. Unless, of course, they're on Kodachis, which seems to be getting somewhat popular nowadays, in which case this card is just amazing into them. You know, the Kodachi for 1, you Hypothermia to turn's dead. Against Viserai Briar, Hypothermia basically just stops the Thorn at the end, so you can think of it as a block 4 from Arsenal, which is still pretty good. You block 4 split damage from Arsenal, that's pretty good. And Blizzard, well, doesn't need much of an explanation into any of these matchups. It just basically, you demand an extra blue from your opponent, which usually they don't have, and then you stop their turn with the Blizzard. Then we go into the defensive cards for each matchup, and here's where the sideboards start to diverge. So my concept for the defensive cards in each matchup revolves around the chess piece that I'm bringing into that matchup. So against Briar and Fi, I have Tunic, and so I'm okay bringing some of the 1-cost defensive options, like Oasis Respite and Sigils of Permafrost, but I don't like having too many cards in my deck that ask for my Tunic resource. So really, I'm only ever bringing either Oasis Respite or Sigil of Permafrost, and I'm not bringing both. So for Briar, I bring in the Oasis Respite because basically everything they do, including Thorn, comes in for 4. And I also bring in the 3 Sync Billows for this reason. And I don't like the Sigils against Briar or Viserai because both those decks still pack a decent number of blues. And Sigil Permafrost basically just taxes his opponent an extra blue as well. It's a bit like Blizzard in that sense. So they have a decent number of blues, and also they have AB2 most of the time. So what I found kept happening was that, sure, I stopped their turn, but I barely dealt any damage while doing so, and I used 3 cards in their turn to do this. So, like, they'll be like, oh, okay, I guess my turn's done. I'm just going to block 2 to this Waning Moon, take 1 and the additional Frostbite. Over to you. You have, like, 2 cards. You can't threaten damage with that. And so all that and all I've done is just leak 1. For Fi, however, I do like the Sigils of Permafrost, because Fi has fewer blues, and at least so far, the Fis I've been testing again only pack AB1. So, I stopped the turn and leak 2 damage, which just feel a lot more significant than just like leaking 1. Though, if Iyslander does rise in popularity a bit and Fi starts to pack more AB, then this is something I will revisit as well, like whether I do want the sigils into them. Into Viserai, we don't have Tunic. Rather, we kind of have the opposite, where we want to pitch into our chess piece all the time. So I only bring in the 0 cost defense reactions into Viserai, so that's the 3 Sync Billows and the 2 Fate Foreseens. These will almost always just help you with blocking a Morven Skies on hit, like efficiently, and so they feel really good. Also into Viserai, I bring in the one of Scour over here. This one of Scour was, again, like just a meta call. I had more of these in the list earlier, but I realized I needed some other things. So I couldn't find space for more. But in terms of the aggro decks, I was expecting Viserai to be the most. So that's why this is the one of Scour here. And Scour is really nice because against Viserai, this is basically a secret red. Because if you manage to hit 3 rune chants with your Scour, which is, it's not uncommon, like a very common thing is they go non-attack into Spellblade Assault. And then you pitch a blue to the Scour, well, you've basically gotten 6 points of value. You've dealt them 3 arcane, and you've saved yourself 3 life because those rune chants aren't coming at you. So that means you paid 3 for 6, which is on rate for a red, but this is a blue. So just that versatility can honestly come in really handy at times. Yeah, just a burst of arcane can be something they don't expect. Like there have been times where there have been a couple of times where opponent goes Moderate Tide, Spellblade Assault, they create 5 on the back, and then I'm like, here's 5 arcane from Arsenal, and it's like, I was not expecting that. So that brings us to just under 60 cards for each matchup, and I rounded out the remaining 60 with just certain cards that seem to perform better in one matchup over the other. Like I found like Amulet of Ice performed a little better into Briar, whereas the 3rd Freezing Point performed a little better into Viserai. All those are like just the 59 60th cards that is in the Excel sheet. As for the arms pieces, we want AB1 into both the Rune Blades. So for Viserai, we get the AB from the chess piece, so we're fine there. But against Briar, since we're bringing Tunic, we do want to bring in Metacarpus into Briar. And of course, against Fire, we just bring in the Ironhide. They have no AB. So tips and tricks for the aggro matchups. Don't bother with Frost Hex at all. Literally just pitch it to Coronet Peak instead, even if that means you like don't use a whole hand. Like don't get baited into like, oh no, if I just pitch Coronet Peak, I'm left with 2 cards, the Arsenal one doesn't feel value. Just Coronet Peak is still better in that case. On the other hand, though, do try and find a spot to set up Insidious Chill. Typically, this happens when you're able to play a Channel Lake Frigid on their turn and follow it up with a Disruptive Red attack on your turn. So, like, you Channel Lake Frigid on their turn, maybe leak some damage, and on your turn you CNC or Erase Face pitching an ice card, or you Fuse Ice Vein pitching an ice card, which means your channel stays around and you've just gotten a bunch of cards from your opponent. That's typically the best point I found where you can, like, take the time to set up Insidious Chill, and that really just solidifies your footing in the game. Another tip is that it's totally okay to Arsenal a defense reaction in these matchups if that's like the most efficient thing. If that ends up being the most efficient way for you to play a hand. And I feel like at first I felt really bad like Arseling a D-react over like a blue ice card. But if you think about like say giving your opponent a Frostbite or 2 as like blocking 1 attack from them, which is like blocking 4 points of damage, well your D-react kind of does the same thing. So in terms of like the value you've gotten from your arsenal is still the same. And so putting a D-React in there does, end up still feeling kind of good. So now onto the Frost-Hex matchups. So that is Bravo, Oldhim, and Dorinthea. And when I say the Frost-Hex matchups, I mean the matchups where our plan is to set up 2 to 3 Frost-Hexes on our opponent and then kill them via Frostbites in the endgame with like big Sigil Permafrost plays and big Ice Eternal plays. So first thing is that every defensive card we own comes into the 60. And I know I said I don't like having both Oasis Respite and Sigil Permafrost in the same 60, but this is a special case because I don't view the Sigils as blocking cards in the first cycle of the deck. Because unless I really have to, I'm not casting these Sigils until my opponent has 2 to 3 Frost Hexes on them, which is typically in the second cycle of the deck. So what I want to do is pitch them and then play them later, which is why I'm actually running 3 of the yellows. And I have to say it was kind of refreshing. This is like the first time in Fab where I felt the need for the yellows more than I felt the needs of the reds and the blues. It's kind of interesting just from a design perspective, because this is like the first time I felt like I have a card that I both want to pitch and I want to play. Like I want to pitch it solely for the purpose that I want to see it later on when I need it, and then but when at that point when I do see it again, I do want to play it immediately. It's not I don't want to like pitch it again like a Heart of Finder or something like that. So I run 3 yellows, and the yellows like pitch easily to Waning Moon. And there's also all sorts of other configurations where it's like you pitch it to Cold Snap plus Oasis Respite, for example. Or, you play a 0 cost from Arsenal and after you pitch this Waning Moon, so that's also pretty big. Yeah. Or even Oasis Respite plus pay for your Ironhide Gauntlet or something like that. However, I did feel like I needed a bit more redundancy of the effect. That's why I added in the 4th Sigil Permafrost, and that's a red one. Yeah, just because sometimes go wrong, like, sometimes things go wrong, like, you get pummeled too much and you lose like 2 of your sigils, and then just having like 1 left in the deck is like not enough. So, just for redundancy, I did want to add the 4th in. Next, we add in 2 Hypothermias. So, I mean, against Dory, this card is just, it's always good. But against Guardians, this was again, a meta call. Like I said earlier, the Guardians I've been playing against all are trying to aggro us down with like E-Strikes and Rouses and Zealous Beltings. So if you can Hypothermia any one of these cards, which, they are running 3 of each, so like 9. If you Hypothermia any one of these cards, you basically blocked 6 from Arsenal, which is massive, right? And it's 6 because the Anathos comes in for 6, and Oldhims don't need a shield against us, so they're running the Sledge, so that's another 6. So, you Hypothermia one of those cards, that's massive value from your arsenal. Because, this matchup's all about, like, buying yourself time to set up your Frost Hexes and set up your Chills. The 2 Amulets of Ice also come in. Against Dory and Bravo, they're just a bit more redundancy it gives you more of the Insidious Chill trigger effects. But against Oldhim, they actually have an additional very important use. And that's because, like, what happens against Oldhim is that when you trigger, say, your 1 or 2 Insidious Chills against them, like, they pitch to attack you, you trigger the Insidious Chills, they pitch further into it, now they have, like, no cards in hand, but they have 1 to 2 floating, and then you're like, okay, cool, you can go for the combo, and you try and, like, hit them a bunch with your, like, either a Fuse Sigil into, like, some tall arcane damage spell. What they can do is use their floating to activate Crown of Seeds and get 1 more card in their hand. And so to rip that extra card out of the hand, you do need to have the Amulets of Ice, because these aren't triggered effects that add activated effects. You can wait for them to resolve the Crown of Seeds, and then they responded to whatever you put on the stack, so you respond to that as well. But after Crown of Seeds has resolved, you activate the Amulet of Ice and rip that card out of the hand. We also add the 3rd copy of Freezing Point, and typically I like to get at least 1 of these into my pitch tag somewhere. The easiest way to do this is usually like a Sink Below or a Fate Foreseen if you can opt it down. And ideally, if it's somewhere near a Sigil of Permafrost, that's perfect, because then you can do the play where you fuse a Sigil of Permafrost into a Fused Freezing Point, which is now coming in for 8 because they have like 3 Frost Hexes on them, and threatening that many Frostbites. So typically that turn ends up being like 20 or 30 damage, and you probably just kill them that turn. Other than that, it is still just tall arcane for the rest of the game, and it's important to whittle your opponent down. And at worst, it also blocks 3, so that's totally fine. The 1 energy potion also comes in. with the Frost-Hex game plan, having extra resources on demand is just necessary sometimes to push that Ice Eternal, just a little bit further. I don't like having more than one because of the liability of having zero blocks into these matchups. Like having a zero block into like Dory, for example, or Bravo can honestly sometimes feel really, really bad. And also, we already have a lot of things we want to set up. Like, there's the Amulets of Ice, there's 1 to 2 Insidious Chills, there's 2 to 3 Frost Hexes, that I found that I never really needed, well, never had the time to set up more than one E-Pot, and with how aggressive everyone's being into us, I didn't find the need for more than one E-Pot either. So I only have one E-Pot in the list. Against Dory, I also bring in the Blizzards, because, against Dory, Blizzards are basically blocking cards. It stops the second Dawnblade swing. Against Guardians, I don't, because there are enough times that they aren't going wide that just having the no block in your hand can be extremely painful. Right, next, the ranges. And, well, when I say ranges, I mean Lexi. Sorry, Azalea players. This is a very interesting matchup, to be honest. The crux of the game plan here is like the tempo strategy that we want to do against aggro. So, not Frost Hexes, but at the same time, it is actually very hard for us to bring in our defensive options into Lexi. And that's for two reasons. Well, one, all the Lexis I tested against are bringing Heart of Ice. So obviously defense reactions into Heart of Ice is bad. And also just Lexi's natural ability to like give you a Frostbite at the start of their turn. Having like some direct when you have a Frostbite, like a zero cost, it's very, very frustrating. So between the Heart of Ice and the Frostbites that they give you, you can really get stuck on like awkward hands if you have too many D-Reacts in your list. Having a small number of the zero cost D-Reacts has felt fine because, like you can respond to the Frostbite of the Heart of Ice by playing a zero cost from Arsenal and pitching a blue to Waning Moon, and then you have one floating to pay for your zero cost defense reaction, like through a Frostbite or through the Heart of Ice. So I do have a small number of the zero cost defense reactions, but most of the defensive options I do side out into Lexi because of this reason. So that brings us to our next meta call. Since I was expecting a lot of Viserais and a lot of aggro decks, I was also expecting a lot of Lexi. Because I do think like Ice Lexi is probably the worst matchup for the Viserais and the Fies and the Briars. And so, because I was expecting a lot of Lexi, I really wanted Encase. Encase is a lot of times a must block for the Lexi opponent, because if they cannot activate their hero ability to flip over their Arsenal card, that means they don't get an extra Arsenal zone because of the headpiece. And if they don't get the extra Arsenal zone, they can't load an arrow with Voltaire, and that typically means they can't give an arrow go again. So, which means that if you encase them and they have an arrow in their arsenal, which is pretty common nowadays, they are running a lot more arrows now. And because, the game plan is like triple arrow, like as much as they can, and that needs to start with an arrow in arsenal. If they have an arrow in arsenal and you hit them with an encase, that is the only arrow that's coming at you that turn. So that is kind of just like a big tempo swing, especially since for you, this was just a 2-card hand, which is the encase and the fuse. But for them, it's like you're basically taking the entire turn. They're just firing the one arrow. So I really want to encase because I was expecting Lexis. And then, of course, we also bring in CNC. You're into Ranger, you bring in CNC. There's an added benefit here, though. So, alright, so what makes this matchup tricky is that we have the tools to stop the Lexi's turn, right? Like, we have the Hypothermias, we have the Blizzards, we have the Channel Lake Frigids. But when we do those things and we end the Lexi's turn, they just say, alright, cool, I will Arsenal this and have a 6-card hand, and then can you deal with my 6-card hand next turn? And then say you can say if another one of those things, again, they're like, I'm still going to have 6-card hand after 6-card hand into you because you keep stopping my turn so much. Eventually, you run out of ways to stop their turn, and then you need to deal with the 6-card hands. So, basically, I found that Lexis end up with 2 cards in the arsenal a lot more against us than when they're against other decks. And so, you kind of really need the CNCs that much more. Like, you really need to threaten those. I also bring in Erase Face. The funny thing about Iyslander is that she is actually really bad at paying for taxes herself. So, like, even getting one Frostbite from the Lexi's ability or from, like, a fused Blizzard Bolt, and if you go into your turn with a Frostbite, it's actually incredibly frustrating because you cannot Coronet Peak. You can't Coronet Peak efficiently. So, if you can't get rid of the Frostbite on their turn, on your turn, you're kind of just forced to, like, block out because you won't have anything efficient to do on your turn. That's why bringing the Erase Phase to put a pause on that disruption. But another thing about Erase Phase is that Channel Lake Frigid in this matchup is the equivalent of the Channel Mount Heroic in the Briar Mirror. Like, yeah, Channel Lake Frigid is a Channel Mount Heroic of this matchup. So, like, whenever either side has a Channel Lake Frigid, like, tempo is kind of basically entirely on that person's side. Because, like I said, Iyslander is really bad at paying for taxes, and so is Lexi. Like, everything, Lexi needs to activate the bow and then fire the arrow. It's like, they get taxed a lot by Channel Lake Frigid, and so do we. So, anything you can do to either delay that Channel Lake Frigid or, like, stop them from keeping it around is something that you definitely want, and that's why Erase Face comes in against Lexi. Blizzards and Hypothermias also definitely come in, just stop them from going wide, stop them from compounding their disruptive effects. Like, when they do a fused Ice Vein and they get to fire another arrow, then that arrow also has a disruptive effect of, like, the Ice Vein or Blizzard Bolt, so Hypothermias, Blizzards, really good into them. Channel Leak Expanse also comes in, and I'm not sure whether Lexis are running out of wars into us, but in any case, 3 of a Kind is also pretty bag-breaking for us, because, like, Iyslander just hates when opponents get resources out of nowhere. Like, Belittle is one, obviously the worst offender. 3 of a Kind's another one, Out of War is another one. So, Channel Leak Expanse comes in for those. Again, similar to Viserai, I would caution, like, dumping this in Arsenal too early. Just wait to see how the Lexi opponent's playing, whether they have those Out of Wars, before you, try and put this in your arsenal. We also bring in the 3rd copy of Freezing Point. Also a 3rd copy of 8th Hail. Like I said, since we can't bring in the defensive options, we do, like, go sort of further into the offensive options. So the 3rd copy of 8th Hail, 3rd copy of Freezing Point comes in. Also, since we are bringing 3 copies of Encase, which is what we want, we might as well bring in as many Freezing Points as we can, just in case we get lucky and manage to pull off the Encase on our turn into Strider's Freezing Point on their turn for, like, 10 damage, because all the equipment and the heroes frozen, so Freezing Point is going to come in for 10. So having all 3 of each just increases the chance that happens, but it's not something that we're playing towards. Both those cards are just good on their own. Like, NK is just good on its own, and Freezing Point is just one way to, like, whittle them down as well. So next we have the Illusionists, and against Prism, like, you sit across your opponent and they flip over Prism, just thank them for the game and just leave and go have lunch. Because it'll just be better for you to save your brain energy than actually play that matchup. Against Dromai, the plan is to try and race them as fast as you can. So we just bring in everything except the defensive cards. We don't bring the Scours. I just bring in everything else because we don't want to see the defensive cards at all. We do, just anything that deals damage to them, we do want to bring in. In this matchup, you want to arsenal cards that can just end their turn. Because, once they build up a board of dragons, they'll be looking to just play, like, one red thing and just swing out. So things that end a turn are Hypothermia, because the dragon attacks, you Hypothermia, and the dragon no longer has go again. Blizzard's also really good. Channel Lake Frigid, of course, because they are unlikely to be able to pay for, like, every dragon to attack. We also have 6 Poppers, also ends their turn, and any of these blue damaging spells, if you kill the attacking dragon while it's attacking, the go again doesn't resolve, and you have basically ended the turn. However, we are definitely, like, on a huge timer in this matchup, because at some point we will just run out of ways to end the Dromai's turn, and then we're getting hit for, like, 20 from, like, all the dragons, because we don't have a good way to deal with those dragons efficiently. This matchup overall, it's tough. We are definitely unfavored. But unlike the Prism matchup, it is winnable. So, that's at least nice. Like, because Dromai might have, like 8 AB on the board, but in their hand, they typically only have like 4 to 6 resources. They're very red heavy deck. So we tried to take advantage of that fact and just keep going at them with tall arcane spells and hope that we get there. In this matchup, definitely be okay with trading health, even if you're making inefficient health trades, like taking 4 to deal like an extra 2, for example. Just, it's fine because the longer the game goes, the worse it is for us. So, just be okay with trading the health early on in the game. Next, we have the Mirror against another Iyslander. In this one, we don't bring in any of the D reacts. We do bring in Oasis Respite though; it's really good there. But none of the D reacts. Also cut the blizzards and cut 1 hypothermia. Although this is debatable because they are still blues in the end, so like they're basically block 3s in the matchup. So there might be an argument to like bring these in just just because they're blues. This matchup is very slow and grindy, and there is a lot to be said about like priority windows and stuff, which I'm not about to cover in this deck tech video, so I'm just going to go over a couple of the other key points that I found. One, prioritize these physical attacks. We bring in all 3 CNC and all 3 erase phase here. The CNC on hit doesn't really matter, but the main reason is that this is damage you can present to your opponent that doesn't give them value from their chess piece, which is very important, right? Because if your opponent's setting arcane damage at you, you're constantly getting value from the chess piece, but if you're setting physical attacks back at them, you are denying them those extra resources on the chess piece. And because of how slow and grindy this matchup is, it's really about just maximizing the resources you have and like trying to eke out just resource advantages. And that's where like this chess piece comes in. So you want to deny your opponent those while, you know, taking advantage of them just setting arcane at you. As far as the on-hit effects, so CNC's on-hit is rarely relevant, but erase phase can very well put your opponent in a bind. The most relevant fuse in this matchup is the Aether Ice Veins, but to pull off a red Aether Ice Vein, you need 3 cards in your hand. You need your pitch card, you need the Ice Vein itself, and you need the fuse card in your hand as well. So your opponent can't actually block erase phase while also keeping a hand that can actually fuse a red Aether Ice Vein. Because of that, erase phase can actually be very awkward for them. And also similar to the Lexi matchup, Channel Lake Frigid is the Channel Mount Heroic of this matchup. And anything you can do to make playing that card awkward for your opponent is something you definitely want to take. Number 2, don't ever activate Cardnet Peak in this matchup. Just hold that blue and pass priority. And honestly, if you're expecting a lot of Icelanders, try and find space for Nullrune Hood instead and bring that in. Because then you can actually block a red Aether Ice Vein completely, and that's really huge. So that covers all the matchups that I felt like I had enough practice into to like talk about. I basically categorized the other heroes like the Brutes and the Boltons as like people's like pet decks. And I didn't really prioritize testing them. I really prioritized testing into the Runeblades, into Fi, into Guardians. And just a little into Dory and into Ranges as well. So I even had Dash in this category of people's pet decks, but then of course Dash went and won the calling. So, you know, now I do need to give that deck some attention. But because I haven't like extensively tested into any of these matchups, I just don't feel like I have enough things to say about these matchups. So I'm just going to leave it to the Excel sheet. Like I have, you know, the 13 cards I would take out for each of these matchups. They're still there in the Excel sheet, but I will say those are mostly based in theory and what I've heard from other Icelanders rather than based in practical experience. So finally, I want to talk about notable exclusions from my list and any future changes that I might be looking to make. The first big exclusion is Red Ice Bolt. And to talk about why I excluded Red Ice Bolt, I think it's very necessary to compare it to a card which I think is very close to it, and that is Freezing Point. So against Guardians, and to break this down, I want to talk about the purpose of Red Ice Bolt or Red Freezing Point into the different matchups. So against the Guardians or against, when I'm on the Frost Hex game plan, I definitely want Freezing Point in my 60 over Red Ice Bolt. And you might ask, oh, why not both? Well, because I do think I do want the 12 defensive options I have as well. So between the 12 defensive options, 3 Freezing Points, 3 Red Ice Veins, because Ice Veins are just straight up amazing. I found that I can close out the remaining reds with just the Red Aether Hails, which are about the same as Ice Bolt. I don't actually need the Ice Bolts. So basically when I was on the Frost Hex game plan, I realized I'm not actually bringing Ice Bolt into the 60 anyway. And then into aggro, Ice Bolt and Freezing Point fulfill the same purpose 95% of the time, in that they're just use 2 cards to send 5 arcane. There are some minor upsides and downsides to both. For example, Ice Bolt is an ice card, so, you know, you can fuse with it. At the same time, it's a red ice card, so fusing with it is kind of awkward because then you're arsenaling that red, and that just not what you want to do usually. But anyway, yeah, so Ice Bolt's an ice card, it can fuse, but Freezing Point can be fused with, so it triggers Insidious Chill, and then you can get like a DIY Ice Vein, or, you know, even your Amulet of Ice. Ice Bolt costs 1 less, so you could potentially like pair it with the Tunic resource and get an extra 2 damage from your Waning Moon. But if you Striders out your freezing point on your opponent's turn, depending on what your blue and arsenal was, the freezing point itself can come in for 6 to 7 off the Striders, because if you give them a frostbite or an affliction like hypothermia, then your freezing point's damage gets increased. But these are all very, very minor upsides. Okay, I threw out the 95% just now. I don't know what the actual percentage is, but basically most of the time, Ice Bolt and freezing points are just 5 arcane on your turn, like against an aggro deck. Since these two are effectively the same card, and again, I don't have space in the 60 for both Ice Bolt and freezing point into aggro decks, because like I said, I am prioritizing like CNCs and erase faces, that I found that even if I had Ice Bolt in the 80, I'll be picking between Ice Bolt or freezing point to bring it into aggro. And since the upsides, and since it's basically the same card, like it arguably is like neutral in terms of advantage or disadvantage versus freezing point, I figured why waste the sideboard slots on Ice Bolt. So there is an exception to this. The exception is there is exactly one matchup currently where I actually do want both freezing point and Ice Bolt in, and that is Dromai. Because against Dromai, like I said, we side out the entire defensive suite and we just want to go as tall as possible. So I do want both Ice Bolt and freezing point into Dromai. But however, here is where I made the meta call. Like to me, the choice was between fitting in 3 Encases or 3 red Ice Bolts. Since I was expecting a lot of Viserai, I was expecting fewer Dromais as the tournament went on and potentially more Lexis. So I made the call that I'd rather be prepared against Lexi than prepared against Dromai. And so that's where I was like, I'd rather have these Encases in my list rather than Ice Bolts, because I felt like I was forced to pick between those two since I wasn't willing to cut like anything else. The other big exclusion is Nourishing Emptiness. I mean, obviously this card doesn't work with CNC and Erase Face, and I've already explained why I really like those cards. The other thing about Nourishing Emptiness is that I found its on-hit to be very unimpressive anyway, because Icelander's 5-card hands are very... they're unimpressive. They like typically the on-hit Nourishing Emptiness just means you get an extra card to block with, which I mean is still good, because I mean then you're getting 9 points of value, because you sent 6, extra card block with is 3, 9 points of value. But in my eyes, CNC and Erase Phase do the same thing, except they let you do it 6 times during the game rather than just once. So that was why I landed Nourishing Emptiness. Then of course also like the 3rd copies of Blizzards and Amulets of Ice. Honestly, I was finding these no blocks to be extremely clunky alongside the vast number of 2 blocks we already have. So I just wanted to increase the average block value of my deck. And the other thing about Iyslander is that a lot of times your disruption is like already stopping them from going wide. For example, like especially like when you have Channel Lake Frigid out, typically the aggro opponent's only coming in for like one thing. And I was finding these blizzards, the fact that I could only like pitch them or play them, I was finding them very, very awkward. And I felt like 3 was too many. And I was good enough with 2 because alongside all the other disruption, I didn't feel like it was very necessary. So, future changes. These are basically all the cards that are on my watch list for cards that I might remove or I'm constantly re-evaluating to see if this level plays. The first one is Blue Ice Veins. If aggro decks start packing AB3, then the stock of Blue Ice Vein goes very, very down. Yeah, I could, not entirely sure what I'll replace with it yet. I know there's talks of Blue Brain Freeze potentially being a replacement, and that's also something very interesting to consider. Again, that's a card that's dependent on the meta. If there's lots of Briars around, then yeah, Blue Brain Freeze sounds awesome. But if we're going into like an aggro dash meta, then I don't think a Blue Brain Freeze hits many things, so I'll need to come back to this Blue Ice Vein. Of course, if aggro decks start packing AB3. Encase, like I said earlier, for this version of the deck list, Encase was here because I was expecting Lexi a bit more than I was respecting Dromai. And of course, if that switches some point, then I would swap out these Encases for red Ice Bolts. Scour, I mean, Scour has already gone from a 3-off in my deck to a 1-off, so it's basically like kind of already cut. But even this 1-off Scour, this was here because out of all the aggro decks, I was respecting Viserai the most. So this was here, but if that changes, if Dash is suddenly now the aggro deck we need to respect the most, then, you know, this is a card that will also be cut. Channel Bleak Expanses, this was here because Belittles were running pretty rampant, like up to like honestly like a month ago. And I thought it'd still be a decent number of people in Belittle, that's why it's still here. But as Belittle starts to disappear more and more from the meta, this is another card that I'll also be looking to cut. And, hopefully replace with something that's more useful into a more wider variety of matchups. So that does it for the deck tech. If you stayed this long and listened to me ramble for so much, thank you for doing that. And I just wanted to end this video by opening up the gold foil that I won at the calling. Here it is. I haven't opened it yet. Thought I'll just open it at the end of this deck tech video. So yeah, I guess I should. Let's make this bigger. This should be good enough. Yeah. So. All right. Ooh. Oh wow. Oh, I am very. Oh wow, it's gold foil grasping. Oh, this is brilliant. I'm very happy about this. Yeah, there we go for everyone to see. It seems like they did also do the little grading on it, as I believe they announced a long time ago. Yeah, so solid. I was worried it might be a filthy illusionist card, and I'll need to like get rid of it by like selling to someone because I'm not gonna hold on to that. Yeah. So that was the deck tech and the gold foil opening. Thank you so much for watching and hope you enjoyed it.